Coogs House. It's officially mid-August. All eyes on Stephen F. Austin coming to Houston later this month. But with the season approaching, would the Houston Cougars benefit from having a real rival in the conference?
You are Locked On Cougs, your daily podcast on the Houston Cougars, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome to Locked On Cougs, the daily podcast about your Houston Cougars. I'm your host, Houston-born teacher and coach Parker Ainsworth. And whether you're a Houston fan or just a hater who came to step by, thank you for making the Locked On Cougs your first listen of the day. Appreciate you making your first listen each and every day. You're at Locked On Cougs. If you enjoyed the conversation, but you don't know what to say, tell us in the comments down below as an everyday you are. If you're a Cheez-It person, a Goldfish person, or some other alternative option that I don't know about with my toddler type of person. Today's show is brought to you by Game Time. Best place to get last week's lowest prices guaranteed. We'll talk more about that later on. As far as the trivia from last episode goes, the answer was the program's single game assist record. I have done as Reed Geddes with 17 assists in 1985 versus those Rice Owls. Speaking of rivalries with the Rice Owls, I want to talk in the first segment here about if you even need one, what the purpose of one is, what having one could do for Houston. Second segment, I've got an idea of a great option. I think the best option off the top of my head. Third segment, another couple of options I think worth diving into. And I will say I'd like to go, frankly, through the whole conference over the course of this exercise at some point or another. I think there's kind of different ties to everyone. But first, rivalry, a team you look forward to playing and beating every single year. The Big 12 has only protected a few of these and not even every single one. Conference realignment has struck down a lot of rivalries. I mean, we saw Bedlam in Oklahoma, between Oklahoma State and Oklahoma, get split up. We've seen Texas A&M at one point was not the same conference as Texas. They put that back together, but I don't think either one's actually that happy about it. There was at one point it looked like you were going to have like USC and UCLA in a different conference, and then those things got switched up. And you talk about like having to move Duke and Carolina together if you're going to move them because they're not going to go without the other. When Houston missed out on the Big 12 boat in the mid 90s, that was kind of one of the biggest things they lost was they had all of these in-state regional rivalries with local area teams. They played Texas and hated Texas, frankly beat Texas more often than people give them credit for. They had rivalries with A&M, SMU, Arkansas. These were all rivalries. And then suddenly some schools went one way and Houston was left behind. And while Houston has clawed and clashed their way up into the Big 12 since then, they've kind of had to kind of work their way through some different rivalry. Yes, they have the Bayou Bucket, Houston and Rice. That's fine. Rice isn't really a P4 option, much less a Power 4 hopeful. It's crosstown, and that's great. But Houston leads that all time, 34-12. Has put up over 45 points in 15 different football games against them. Has broken 60 in 5 different football games against Rice, and they don't even play every year. I get the crosstown thing. I like that, but that doesn't feel like the kind of intensity we're looking for. You lost a potential rivalry with SMU and Memphis and leaving the American. And I guess that's something you kind of had built into the last 10 years and building that up with some exciting SMU and Memphis football games between them and Houston, obviously, including big comebacks on Houston, last minute walk-off returns and all that kind of like crazy games. I mean, I don't mean to downplay that, but you don't have them in your conference anymore. And it looks like with the Memphis getting the boot and not getting let in after saying they would pay their way in, you're really not going to see Memphis anymore either. But rivalries can create a clear identity to your season. It can kind of pinpoint your focus on the season. If you're in a rebuilding or a rough spot as a program, they can kind of keep you looking forward to something. Well, at least we can go beat such and such, right? At least we can knock the socks off of blank. At least we can ruin so-and-so's season, right? Those are the fun things. It gives you bragging rights even when you have a season not worth bragging about if you do those kinds of things. And then the inverse, when you're at the top in a couple of years, when Houston's program is completely rebuilt, and I think it's moving faster than people give credit for in terms of the rebuild. But in a couple of years, when it is completely rebuilt and Henderson is pushing for Heisman's and those kinds of things, you're looking at Houston as like a need to keep on your toes because you know that program's coming with all they've got because of the rivalry, right? Those kinds of moments are lost when you don't have a rival. It adds an element of a hate watch to every week, every move, everything. You antagonize, you spite. There's, and I don't mean to say like it's good to be a hater, but it is a cool part of college sports, right? College sports and rivalries are something that just it just doesn't exist in the same way in pro sports. And in pro sports, for what it's worth, like guys are fairly transient, and maybe that does go away with college sports too as the guys become moving a lot more. But there's only 32 pro football teams, right? The players for Green Bay and Minnesota are going to have a lot in common, and some of them will have gone to college together or high school, or have the same agent, work out the same facilities, grow up in the same small town, whatever the case may be, right? There are people on like the Eagles and Giants that hate each other, sure, but like most of those guys understand this is a fan rivalry. It's a big game because they play each other twice a year in the NFL, but it's not like the same kind of rivalry as Auburn, Alabama, where the Alabama guy went to jail for poisoning Auburn's trees or something like that, right? Like there's none of that kind of vitriolic hatred in between pro fan bases, generally speaking. Further, it's also not quite as rampant in pro sports to have rivalries. It's more of like a divisional kind of thing, right? Um, in college sports, it's everywhere. It's everything. It's Texas and Oklahoma. It's Ohio State and Michigan. It's USC, UCLA. It's the Civil War in Oregon. It's the backyard brawl, Pittsburgh, West Virginia. And they managed to keep that up even after not being the same conference. It's Catholics and convicts with Notre Dame and Miami. It's all those different things. And that is a key part of a college sport experience that Houston fans are just not getting in the current landscape. And I want to do a thought experiment across the conference about how you could build this up with any of the other 15 programs in the conference. I think that there's validity to all 15 potentially in some way, shape, or form. We talked about it with the space race and UCF before. They'll get their segment at some point if we come back around to them. Maybe we'll talk to Mike Giddens over at Locked on UCF about that one. I think there's something to do with West Virginia and like the way that they got into the conference before Houston. And there's like a Dana Holgorsen element to that, and a hatred element to that. There's also just a cultural difference between Houston and West Virginia in a lot of ways that maybe we'll talk to Mountaineer Paulson about that. We may talk to folks I'm talking about their programs today too. I don't mean like exclude them. We'll see how they get in and out of the show and all that, because they all have, to their credit, rivalry games to talk about. And Houston needs one. And I think it's a very important part of what's happening here. It's an important part of college athletics. And while Rice is a fun game, it's also not on the schedule forever. They don't play them every year. And only a handful, like the Holy War, BYU, Utah, only a handful get to be played every year in the Big 12. But I think Houston could work towards that. I think it's going to take some artificial pushing of an agenda to start one. It absolutely will, and that's going to rub some people the wrong way, but it's going to take some like emphasis on a handful of contests here at the start of your time in the Big 12 to let things happen naturally. Well, there's a couple that could happen really naturally, including one that I think is probably off my head the most clear-cut option for a lot of reasons, but that may just be me being a history teacher. Before we get to that, though, I do want to tell you about our buddies over at 5-Hour Energy. Now, it's time to fuel up and return it up with those 5-Hour Energy transfusions. It's a bold grape, ginger, lime flavor for your favorite golf drink. It turns into a quick, energizing shot. And whether you're sinking birdies, making memories with friends, this one, it can be a hole-in-one for your golf game. Let's be honest, sometimes in the course or off of it, you just need that extra boost to stay sharp and energized. Listen, my golf game is bad. I need every boost I can get. 5-hour energy helps keep me to where that's at least not one of the problems. Like, I got other problems with my golf game. One of them is not the energy, thanks to 5-hour energy. Golf's all about good times with good people and good flavors, of course. Grape, ginger, and lime flavor give you the best parts of your clubhouse go to without chasing down the Bev card. If you go to 5energy.com today, that's the number 5hourenergy.com. You can use my promo code Locked On Golf to receive 20% off your order. This offer is only valid until September 30th on one order and cannot be used with other promotions. This code is not good on subscription orders, and whether you're meeting up with friends or trying to turn 18 holes into 36, get energizing boost you need to power through our order transfusion flavored 5-hour energy shots today. Party Andrew, Locked On Coogs here, and if Houston's going to add a rival, why not add the closest program? Houston and Waco are as close as they can get, and the Baptists and the Bayou are a rivalry that just feels like it's got to happen. Now, weirdly, before we get into history here, I do think Houston and Waco serve as weird cultural hubs for albeit very different cultures. Houston City School, Bayou, Cajun, this whole region, it's big city folks and downtowns and all that. And while Waco is not the small towns that make up a lot of Central Texas, it does feel like a hub for a lot of that Central Texas aesthetic. Call it the Chip and Joanna effect, but it feels like when people think of those small towns, the China Springs of the world and whatever, they think of Waco as being like the big one, the representative one. And maybe that's because it is the college town or whatever, but it's also a private Baptist university and a public university. I think that's an interesting discrepancy here between two different cultures. You can go back to like the Teef and Yeoman battles, for what it's worth, back in those I think that was the 70s. Yeoman won he was 6-4-1 against Baylor under Teef, and I feel like that's important. It's also worth pointing out that Baylor was Houston's first Southwest Conference game as a member way back in the day, and so that I think is like some nostalgia there. It's been the longest lasting, I guess you could say, as a conference mate in that regard. Ultimately, though, a rivalry with Baylor would come down to, I should say, a rivalry with Baylor would come down to an Ann Richards Bowl. And I don't mean this as a way to disparage politics amongst politicians or anything like that, but Ann Richards is probably, for entirely sports reasons, the most hated politician in University of Houston Cougar history. And that's not to say that has, again, anything to do with anything except for the move to the Big 12. Now, rewind back to the mid 90s. I don't even know if I'm walking and talking. I'd have to talk to my parents, but when I started those kinds of things, you might not have been as a listener to this, right? But the Southwest Conference is falling apart. Arkansas is going to the SEC, and that is kind of a cascading effect across the rest of the conference. And the Big 8 is looking to move to the Big 12. They're going to pull in Texas and Texas A&M as big brands, and they're going to add other schools. And Ann Richards, the governor of Texas at the time, and Lieutenant Governor Bob Bullock, both of those two have a Baylor degree. Bullock's undergrad is actually a tech degree as well. They applied a lot of political pressure to this conference realignment. And reports were, and these are reports, not substantiated in that document, but reports, and to whatever degree that rumor sphere would have happened in the early and mid 90s, that Bullock had told the folks at A&M in Texas that he and Ann Richards were willing to cut funding to the athletic departments of Texas and Texas A&M if the Big 8 only took those two and did not take Baylor and Texas Tech, to which Texas and Texas A&M told the Big 8, we've got to take the other two. We're not cutting our funding, in theory, and they accepted all four, leaving out Houston, but also SMU, Rice, and TCU. Now, I feel like I should point out a couple things. One, this is those were obviously reports way back in the day, right? Substantiated amongst Houston faithful, and I'm thinking Baylor and the Richards camp probably deny all of it. had the bullet camp, I'm sure. But that is to say, Texas A&M and Texas have always benefited from a large athletic funding from the state, coming from different oil fields, like that. Like state money has helped those two programs out in a lot of ways. It stands to reason that potentially losing that would have been a big problem, right? Now, I also would point out that this is happening in this first half of the 1990s. The Dick Schaap article on the violations in the program that kind of hurt the program from a like recruiting sanctions, some of that would follow. David Klingler going to the NFL, that all didn't help, right? Those reasons that were the much more on paper reasons, the much more publicized reasons, those didn't help. SMU, in that same vein, had their death penalty in the late 80s. And so it kind of felt like they were saying, we're not taking those programs because of those things. I will point out, Texas and Texas A&M, every school had their stuff to that point. And Baylor, their stuff included this whole 1993 like fiasco outside of town. And while it's not tied to the university, I would imagine if you'd asked people from the big 8 institutions, like fans and faithfuls and so on from those 8 institutions, do you want to go to Waco every year or do you want to go to Houston? I think they'd have picked Houston based on what was happening in the first half of the 90s in Waco. I don't know. Maybe not. But I do think, though, that this becomes a rivalry because Baylor gets into the Big 12 in the mid-90s. Houston does not. Houston has to claw and scratch and, what I'd say earlier, clatch their way into the conference, right, over the course of 30 years. And Baylor gets a 30-year head start on that, right? And listen, I think Houston's made up a lot of that ground in 2 years, given the complexity of making that up. However, I would also point out that that's a lot of time. and while it is a lot of time, I think that that's part of the fun of this rivalry. I would also point out that Houston and Baylor are both good athletic programs in a lot of ways now. Baylor's had some good run in the last 15 years in football, some highs and lows, right? You could talk about certain football coaches leaving Houston to go to Baylor. That certainly happened. It saw their most successful seasons they've had. It also led to the biggest, we'll say, problems they've had at Baylor. You could talk about the path to their lone national championship in a major sport. That was the 2021 national championship in men's basketball. Ended up beating Houston in the Final Four of that season. I would point out that the Final Four game was closer than the national championship game was that year, but that beatdown is kind of the outlier. Houston's actually beaten Baylor 3 times in basketball every time they played since then, and that was only after the fall of the Southwest Conference. That was only the Final Four game was the second time the two programs had played in basketball since the fall of Southwest Conference. And the first one was a really close game back in 2002. And the first 15 years of Baylor being in the Big 12, pretty much pre-RG3 and Art Briles, Baylor was kind of a laughing stock in that Big 12, right? And I was like, what are they doing here? What it done? Who is this program? What is this school? They had a whole basketball catastrophe in the early 2000s, and it was just bad news bears. And then things turned around, right? They got a Heisman Trophy winner and RG3 and all that. Things changed. I don't mean to say things can't change. It just took them a long time. I would argue Houston's, as far as their time to acclimate, moving much quicker, for what it's worth. They're in charge of the conference in basketball, right? And so I think that that's interesting. I also think it's worth pointing out that, in those first 2 years in the conference, the kind of times you're setting this story as far as being conference rivals, Donovan Smith and the walk-off touchdown at their place in the first Big 12 season was pretty remarkable, left them pretty stunned. And frankly, the school's decision to not fire Aranda, Baylor's decision not fire Aranda after that, even though Houston would fire Dana Holgerson, is an interesting one. And they've kind of chosen a different path, like basically setting up everything else around him differently. That could change the future of their institution and program as well. No, Baylor came back to Houston and beat them the next year, and that alternating may work in the two's favor as far as building a rivalry goes, right? But I think Baylor, because of that history, because of how close they are, because of how different the schools are, in so many ways, I think this feels like a very natural rivalry. I say it to say that I think that this is one that would pay dividends in a very quick fashion, right? They're going to be in on a lot of the same recruits because of the geography, and so the rivalry feed into that. They're going to play each other in football more often than not. They're also the kind of football games that people are going to be at the other's stadium for them, right? And I think that that's important as well. I really like Baylor as the best option, but I want to talk about two other Texas-sized options as well before we get too far. So let's jump into that. But first, before we get into that part of today's show is, as I mentioned at the top, brought to you by our buddies over at Game Time, and we've all been there. Logging on early, waiting forever to go to concert tickets, and to go to concert tickets go on sale, yada yada. You lose your spot right before the show you've been dying to see. And live music should be more about those memories and not dealing with the stress of ticket shopping. That's where Game Time comes in. Game Time makes getting tickets to concerts and other things as well, comedy and games, everything easier than ever. Prices actually drop as you get closer to showtime. You can save up to 60% off with their killer last minute deals. I like that you can toggle to see the all-in pricing. You can see what it's going to look like in that venue for the type of event from that section and row right there. So you know it's going to be where exactly you're looking at throughout the entire concert or whatever. Take the guesswork out of buying tickets with all things Game Time. Download the Game Time app, create an account, and use code Locked On College for $20 off your first purchase. Turn to again, create an account and redeem code Locked On College, LOCKEDONCOLLEGE for $20 off. Download the Game Time app today. Ask for tickets, lowest prices guaranteed. Parker Rangers Locked On Coogs here, and there are two other Big 12 schools in Texas that we haven't mentioned yet. That is TCU and Texas Tech. I think both offer interesting rivalry options. TCU is a Southwest Conference school as well. Actually got added to the Big 12 based on football success in 2012. They announced in October of 2011 they would join the Big 12 on July 1st, 2012. For reference, that October 10th, 2011 was just 2 years to the day from when Houston had beaten Mississippi State, an SEC school, and 2 years and 2 weeks to the day they'd beaten Texas Tech, a Big 12 school, and 2 years and 3 weeks to the day they'd beaten Oklahoma State, another Big 12 school. That season, 2009, Houston beat 3 different Power 5 conference schools, and 2 years later, TCU's the one getting added to the Big 12. And I think there's probably some like why they picked them over us kind of aspect to a potential rivalry with TCU as well. In 2011, the year that we're talking about here, where they decided to add TCU, Houston was in the top 25 as this was all happening, would go on 12-0 before falling the conference title game to Southern Miss, and would ultimately beat Penn State in the Ticket City Bowl game that year. Penn State being the legacy program in the Big Ten, a very historic program. That I think does shape this some. They chose TCU when Houston was a perfectly viable option. For what it's worth, this is also a version of Houston versus the DFW, Metroplex, Fort Worth, and TCU is a little bit different than like the heart of Dallas, but it certainly is that. And up and down 45, people certainly feel that. Houston does hold the all-time lead in this rivalry as it stands by one game, 14-13. That game being last year's matchup, actually in Fort Worth on a Friday. Both technically have a Heisman winner as far as comparing programs go, but TCU's is Davey O'Brien, and that was 8 years before Houston even had a football program. This 10-year head start for TCU does feel important because like they played in a national championship game in 2022 where Houston was like still in the American. However, it also feels like in the present tense, a couple years removed from that game, they're not that far away in terms of football things. Basketball, obviously, they're not in the same strategy either, but I do feel like it's worth mentioning that TCU beat Houston in Houston's first road game in the Big 12, and Houston only has a handful of Big 12 losses as a Big 12 member. One of them is TCU. And so maybe that stratosphere thing is, a bunch of bull junk or whatever Dion would have called it. And then I look at them as an interesting option for a rivalry for a lot of reasons. I don't think they're the same case as Texas Tech. Texas Tech, obviously in Lubbock, you have the opposite end of the state, both almost literally and culturally for sure. Uh, Lubbock represents the Plains, West Texas, the Panhandle. It frankly has a large following in New Mexico and parts of far west Oklahoma and that whole part of the world, right? Houston represents the city, the metro, the Bayou, Cajun, this whole region of the world as well. Those polar opposites, I think, serve an interesting part of the cultural part of this rivalry. It is two big public schools in Texas. I think that's an important difference here, too, because it's frankly a lot of the same people applying to the two institutions, right? And so that's significant. Um, I feel like the big thing here, though, is this is another old Southwest Conference rivalry that Houston at one point kind of dominated. And Tech fans don't want to tell you about it, but like Case Keenum had a big win in that 2009 game we mentioned earlier, right, over Texas Tech. Tech has won the last 6 matchups, and Houston still leads the all-time series 18-6, right? Prior to that Case Keenum game we mentioned, the overall history matchup was 17-10 in Houston's favor. Houston has had more NFL draft picks, more first round draft picks. Houston's football program, on a history perspective, is better than Texas Tech's, but Texas Tech, in the present tense, is the one that's all in on the modernization of pay the players college football. And I think that that's an interesting discrepancy here as well. Listen, I also think that it's worth pointing out that, like, while Tech has been to more bowl games and has had more weeks. Has had Houston's had more weeks ranked in the AP poll, but Tech has been to more bowl games. I think that can be explained as simply as like a 3-loss Big 12 team ends up in a bowl game a lot more often, or ends up picked in a better bowl game, or a 6-loss Big 12 team will do better off in this and that and the other thing than a Conference USA team. And that 30-year window we're talking about here is important in that. I think there's also an interesting basketball element to the Texas Tech Houston rivalry, and Texas Tech doesn't have the history, the Phi Slamma Jamma kind of stuff, quite like Houston does, obviously. But I would point out Texas Tech actually did win the Southwest Conference right after Phi Slamma Jamma was over. That was a coach James Dickey. James Dickey is the same as James Dickey who would come to Houston and precede Sampson, actually. And so that's kind of funny turn of events there. At Texas Tech, he was at Texas Tech before Bob Knight. He wasn't there for 85 season. He was there for the decade before Knight. And Dickey coached Jason Sasser, Marcus Sasser's uncle, at Texas Tech. That same team had Jason Sasser, Tony Petit, whose nephew Dawson Petit is a big-time 2027 target for Houston in recruiting, and Darvin Ham, who has no tie to recruiting right now, I don't guess. But that is to say that, like, Dickey's coached some pretty strong teams in the 90s at Tech, in the mid-90s specifically. And then you get to the Bob Knight of it all. And Bob Knight is a Hall of Famer not because of what he did at Texas Tech. So I don't want to say this like that. But he was successful at Tech in trying to rebuild that program. He is a Hall of Fame coach. And there are a lot of people that really like his coaching style and those kinds of things. Kalma Sampson is a Hall of Fame caliber college basketball coach. He's at Houston after a couple previous stops, including, weirdly, Indiana. And his Hall of Fame career, you could argue, didn't need Houston, but certainly Houston adds to it, right? And it adds to it in a big way, I should say. But he was probably a Hall of Fame guy before, based on what he did at Oklahoma and Washington State. But the other thing is that Bob Knight passing the program at Tech on to Pat Knight is kind of, unfortunately for the late great Bob Knight, like, served as the example of why you don't do that very often. And Houston passing it on from, the coach in waiting, Kellen Sampson, I don't think is going to go anywhere near as poorly as Bob to Pat Knight. Kellen is a very highly regarded, like, other programs wish they could steal him away to be their head coach kind of coach. And Kellen is very involved in how the program runs right now, the family business that is Houston. But Tech under Knight was a family business, and Houston under Sampson is a family business. And I think there's something comparable there as well, even if Houston's finding far more success under Sampson. And it's continuing. Obviously, it's more than a decade in at this point, whereas Knight was there about 10 years as well. I think Tech is a great option. I mentioned I think there are other. I think the other Cougar cat fight can aspect of BYU. There's West Virginia and the cultural differences and that. And again, they got picked in 2012, and Houston did not. Right. I think that there are other options you could look at. And the more, what do they call them, the hateful eight, the Oklahoma State kind of aspect of it. They're looking for a new rival with Oklahoma not in the conference anymore. I think there's Kansas State options, and you kind of ruined their season last year. And how do you spark a rivalry with that kind of thing? Where can you go with these? The Kansas deal where you ruined that night in Fog Allen last year. Like, we can get into all of that over the course of the series. But if you want to talk about rivals in the conference, tell us in the comments down below. And if you want to tag one of the Locked On shows, come and talk about it, do it. And B, if you don't feel brave enough to tag them, tell me, and we'll see what we can work out as far as where other things go. I do think all 15 schools are options here. And while I initially start with 3 Texas schools on proximity's sake, I certainly know that's closer to get. It's probably, I think it's closer to get from Houston to Stillwater than Houston to Lubbock. It's a lot of traveling in this conference. We're bringing things more all week this week as we get into Locked On Cougs. Please subscribe to the bell so you know we're live. If you're looking for the trivia question going into next episode, the trivia question is going to be based on history talk today. And we've mentioned the person's name once, but what is the school record for career total offense in football? Career total offense. Total being a key word there. Locked On Cougs, primarily Locked On Podcast Network means your team every day. Go Cougs.